Welcome to the Wednesday talks of MURCIR. MURCIR is a 30 years old research center in Marmara University, and our main focus is the international relations. We are trying to concentrate on the latest developments in international relations and some aspects of political science. And today we have a very prominent guest speaker, and our title is Changing World Order and Transformation of International Organizations. I would be happy to present the prominent guest speaker's biography. Erdogan Iscan is an ambassador, retired ambassador, and he born in Istanbul in 1954. And when we look at his very long biography CV, you can see very important post and educational details. And especially he became an ambassador in many different international organizations, and the different posts you can see in this biography. And main professional activities can be listed here in this the visual material. He became the permanent representative to the Council of Europe and the Deputy Undersecretary for General Political Affairs in Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Director General for Multilateral Political Affairs in again Minister of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, Ambassador to South Korea, Ambassador to Ukraine, Director for Council of Europe and Human Rights, again in Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it's a very long list. I'm happy to host you, dear Ambassador, in MURCIR today. And I would be happy to listen to your very precious presentation right now. The floor is yours. Thank you for your participation again.
I thank you, Professor, for first of all, for the kind invitation, as well as for the wonderful words of introduction. It is my distinct privilege and honor to have the opportunity to address such a distinguished audience. And I must also confess that it may prove to be a challenge for me to speak to such a distinguished academics. I must first underline that it has always been among my priorities to collaborate with the academia throughout my service in diplomacy. My experience clearly indicates that academia provides substantive input to diplomacy practice. And in fact, it seems to be mutually beneficial. I also believe that diplomacy practice happens to be among the incentives for academic work. And it is with this understanding that I will endeavor to make my presentation. I have made my preparations in order to comply with the proposed title, and first, following certain introductory remarks, I will speak on the evolution of the international security architecture in the post-Second World War era, the Cold War period, unipolar period, transition to multipolarity, and the current situation, how we define the current transition. And also, I will refer to the divergent approaches to international system by the parties, by the contending superpowers. Later, I will speak on the United Nations system and its reform, the slow pace reform. And later, I will speak about the reports, the recent reports by the Secretary General with regard to the future of the United Nations system. And finally, if there is time, of course, I will be happy to share my personal experiences throughout my over 40-year diplomacy service. I doubt I can give much in addition to what the distinguished academics already know, but perhaps I will try to insert my personal observations throughout my diplomacy practice that might make my presentation hopefully interesting. Otherwise, I'm confident that I will be repeating what the distinguished audience already knows. Let me first recall that violence and humanitarian tragedies have shaped the history of human society. Regretfully, it seems that we have not yet been able to fully eradicate such a trend. Throughout history, there have been initiatives aimed at creating the conditions of stability and providing the environment that would be free from fear and violence. The earlier initiatives had not produced the outcome that could raise optimism, and the Second World War unfortunately became unavoidable with, as we all know, with devastating consequences. At the same time, it was a very loud wake-up call. While the war was ongoing, those responsible politicians, diplomats, and academics laid the groundwork for a new universal organization. The United Nations organization was founded in the immediate aftermath of the war. The founding states acknowledged that recognition of the inherent dignity as well as inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I attach importance to repeating this well-known philosophy, the underlying philosophy of the United Nations, because current events, developments, in light of the current developments, the international community seemed to be forgetting the fundamental philosophy of the United Nations. It is, as we all know, it is enshrined in the preamble as well as especially in Articles 55 and 56 of the Charter. And the three pillars of the United Nations, peace and security, human rights, and development, are interconnected. These are laid down in the preamble of the Charter and also in the conventions, the international law instruments following the adoption of the Charter, which was followed by the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on 10 December 1948, which is commemorated as the Human Rights Day every year. The Universal Declaration has served as the foundation of international human rights law. Its 30 articles has been the guiding reference for developing the human rights conventions. Under such circumstances, international human rights law and refugee law have been developed, which are mainly the products of the post-Second World War era. The scope of international humanitarian law, which had roots in the earlier period, has been enlarged and strengthened. Currently, if I am correct about the figure, the United Nations has 560 conventions, which is a huge number. In the words of the United Nations Secretary General, and I quote, "Development of a body of international law that governs relations among sovereign states is one of the great achievements of the United Nations." And I'm firmly convinced of the correctness of this approach. There is a solid, legally binding normative framework, which is under constant review with a view to addressing the rising challenges. The problem seems to be the lack of political will for solidarity aimed at coping with the evolving crises based on the common legal space that has been developed, which is for making progress, which with a view to making progress towards achieving common objectives. At this juncture, allow me, Professor, to refer to the concept of security. The concept of security, in my opinion, needs to be defined in a broader context. It is true that, first and foremost, it involves political and military parameters, but it also involves democracy pillar, which I would call democratic security, a term that was introduced by the Council of Europe, a regional organization born following the birth of the United Nations. Ensuring democratic security is the imperative of creating conditions whereby political stability and military security are safeguarded. It also facilitates creating the conditions of stability in post-crisis situations. Both pre and post-crisis crisis situations, democratic security is important, is an important tool to create the conditions of stability. Following the formation of the United Nations system, we witnessed the establishment of regional organizations in support of the global system in pursuit of the fundamental values of the United Nations Charter. First examples appeared in Europe, including the Council of Europe and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and they were followed by formations in other regions of the globe. Despite the differences in terms of structure as well as functioning and long-term objectives, there is a common denominator for all such regional organizations, and it remains the same for all. They all express commitment to the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We should bear in mind, for example, that NATO defines itself as a military alliance of democratic nations. The founding instrument of NATO, the Washington Treaty of 1949, stipulates such requirement in its preamble. Let me now try to describe the evolution of the system in the last 8 decades, almost 8 decades. First 45 years, between 1945 and 1990, it was the Cold War. It was a bipolar system. The US led NATO, the First World, versus the USSR-led Warsaw Pact, the Second World. We also observed the emerging solidarity and cooperation among the Third World, leading towards the non-aligned movement during that time. Mutual Assured Balance, MAD, defined the balance of power to safeguard the so-called Cold Peace. During the last decade of the Cold War, of the 45-year-long Cold War, that is roughly between 1980 and 90, we witnessed the improvement of the ground for dialogue via the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, then CSCE. It was initiated in the early 1970s and reached maturity at the landmark summit of 1975 in Helsinki with the adoption of the Helsinki Final Act, considered to be the founding document of the organization. I think using the term organization might not be a correct one, because CSCE was a conference. Later, it became an organization after 1994. It covered 3 baskets. We all know, I'm not going into details. And the conference was renamed as the organization, OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation, in Europe at the 1994 summit in Budapest. 1980s were marked by the period of détente, in other words, easing of tensions or improved dialogue. Let me recall at this juncture my professional involvement in the negotiations in Vienna in the second half of 1980s. I was part of the Turkish team between 1987 and 91 for 4 years. First, as the head of section for arms control and disarmament in Ankara, and later in Vienna as a member of the Turkish delegation. During this time, intensive negotiations had been held between the two rival camps, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, aimed at developing confidence and security building measures and reaching consensus on conventional arms control. The later conclusion of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty was a landmark development in terms of the transition of the international system. Simultaneously, negotiations also had been held mainly between the then two superpowers with a view to reducing the nuclear arsenal. Please allow me to share a personal memory, which I think has a symbolic value in terms of this transition during the period of détente. In 1987, I returned home. I mean, from assignment abroad, I returned back to Ankara, and I was assigned as the head of section for arms control and disarmament, and I started getting involved in the continuing arms control negotiations. During that time, 1980s, the second half of 1980s, there was difficulties in getting telephones at home, and we had rather police officers to maintain communication between the ministry and the officers at home. I was quite new. I hadn't had the telephone at home yet, and one Saturday evening, there was a ring at the door, and I opened. There was a police officer inviting me to the ministry upon call from the senior officer, because there was a note verbal from the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, requesting access to observe a military exercise in the Marmara region. 1987, détente, but still two rival camps, and Warsaw Pact and NATO were rivals, and that caused anxiety on the part of the Turkish military, and they said, how come Soviet officers would come to Istanbul and observe the NATO military exercise named Display Determination, and they were excited. But as a matter of fact, it was also Turkey's lead role in getting such, confidence and security building measures as contained then in the Helsinki Final Act, which later developed into Vienna documents. And up to a certain threshold, parties agreed to notify each other of the exercise. And beyond certain threshold, the rivals had the authority to observation of such military exercises. It was a new concept, and we finally convinced the military authorities that it was the part of NATO Warsaw Pact negotiations and deal towards improving confidence and security building measures, and we agreed. Actually, there was no option of not agreeing, but we agreed that the Soviet military team arrived in Istanbul, and they observed the military exercise called the Display Determination. Later, we proposed to the military that it would be beneficial if they formed such inspection teams and start observing military exercises on the other side, on the Warsaw Pact territory, which would be beneficial also not only for military information gathering purposes, but also for improving or reinforcing confidence and security building measures, which came through. The military, the chief of the general staff formed an inspection team, and first, I remember vividly that we sent a note to Moscow and requested access to a military exercise in the Caucasus region. And it was a very beneficial from military perspective, as well as from confidence and security building perspective. That was a memory that I remember, how first there was resistance, but later the parties understood the benefits of having or moving, making progress towards improving confidence and security building measures. It was also, I will continue and give one more example of a personal experience. 1989, I requested, as a matter of fact, to be assigned to Moscow to observe the developments, the ongoing developments. But I was assigned to West Germany in 1989. So it happened very fast. You will remember, I went to West Germany. That was the East Germany. I went to West Germany to join the Turkish embassy in Bonn. And 1 year later, the wall came down, and Germany was reunified, and our embassy became accredited to an enlarged, reunified Germany. And then I was also asked to join our team in Vienna to continue with the confidence and security building measures, as well as the conventional armed forces. So that was a very important period of transition from the Cold War, bipolar Cold War international system, via the détente period towards a temporary unipolar system. So after 1990, the Soviet Union was dissolved. The Warsaw Pact ceased to exist. Former Warsaw Pact members started becoming members of the Council of Europe, and later they joined the European Union, NATO and the European Union. And with the dissolution of the USSR, Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, we had 15 new independent states, and the successor state of the Soviet Union was the Russian Federation. They also started joining the Council of Europe that time. The democracy organization of Europe in the European political geography. And the Russian Federation had no longer possessed the capabilities of the superpower. So we observed a temporary period of unipolar system where the United States played an influential role in shaping the course of international politics. Then, in a few years' time, we started observing the transition to multipolarity again and the newly emerging alliances. It was observed throughout the first decade of the new century, the 21st century, that the successor state of the Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, started making progress towards upgrading its economic and military capabilities, aimed at restoring its status as a superpower again. It was also observed that China continued to make big steps towards consolidating its place among the top three. Meanwhile, in addition to the European Union as a bloc, other states, including India and Brazil, have joined the race to have a growing role in shaping international politics. If I try to say, if I may say a few words on the current situation, the international system is no longer unipolar, led by the United States. It's a multipolar system. In fact, we still observe a challenging transition to multipolarity. Today, it is mainly composed of three groupings. I adopt this terminology. Of course, different approaches may be introduced, but I am of the opinion that we might call these three groupings the Global West, the Global East, and the Global South. One is led by the United States and Europe, the second by China and Russia, and the third by a grouping of non-Western developing states led by India, Brazil, and others. Many ongoing conflicts are, as a matter of fact, stages where those superpower contenders are using their leverages to enlarge their spheres of influence. The current conflicts in Europe and in the Middle East indicate the deepening conflict between the US and its allies on the one hand, and Russia and China on the other. These three worlds are not blocs, nor even coherent negotiating groups or formal political entities. They might be seen as informal and evolving global factions. They can hardly be defined as poles. They are rather loose coalitions seeking to shape global rules and institutions. I will move on to my next topic, which is related to the divergent approaches to international system, the so-called rules-based international order versus international law. The Global West and the Global East cite divergent definitions in terms of their objectives for designing the international system. While the Global West prefers to invoke rules-based international order, the Global East chooses to underline international law. The opposing approaches seem to be unhelpful with respect to facilitating the ground for multilateral negotiations. To the contrary, they make it even more challenging to make progress towards narrowing the existing gaps. In the interest of time, Professor, I believe we may not be able to undertake a detailed analysis as to why the parties choose to invoke such opposing concepts, but perhaps I may try to raise a few remarks. Certainly they will not be exhaustive, and I'm confident that the distinguished academia has its substantive assessments on the topic, and I will hopefully be able to have them in possession and learn from them. First, the United States is not a party to a number of important multilateral treaties that constitute essential components of international law, including, among others, the Law of the Sea Convention, the 1977 protocols to the Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and so on. It also refrained from acceding to a number of international human rights instruments. It placed reservations to some international conventions, including human rights treaties. It would be difficult for the United States to hold states accountable for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law to the extent that these rules are not considered by the United States to be part of customary international law. Second, the interpretations by the United States on international law justifying the use of force and the violation of international humanitarian law are contested by a wide section of the international community. For example, the interpretations placed on Security Council resolutions by the United States and the United Kingdom to authorize the use of force in Iraq in 2003 and in Libya in 2011 have been widely criticized as unlawful pretexts. Furthermore, the United States seems to be unwilling to hold some states, such as Israel, accountable for violations of international law. This exceptionalism in respect of Israel was spelled out by the United States in its joint declaration with Israel on the occasion of President Biden's visit to Israel in July 2022, which reaffirms the, and I quote, the unbreakable bonds between our two countries and the enduring commitment of the United States to Israel's security, and the determination of the two states to combat all efforts to boycott or delegitimize Israel, to deny its right to self-defense, or to single it out in any form, including at the United Nations or the International Criminal Court. Unquote. Such an approach, such an unconditional solidarity or support to Israel is, I think, in a way explains why and how the United States dared to veto the attempts to have a Security Council resolution to end hostilities, to provide ceasefire in order to put an end to the ongoing humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. On the other hand, Russia and China assert that the rules-based international order that has been advanced by the West as an alternative to international law cannot be accepted without examination that it is identical with international law. We know it is not. As yet, there is no indication that they will take the form of general or particular international conventions under the statute of the International Court of Justice. We know that in the International Court of Justice, under its statute and its rules, cannot possibly adjudicate any case on the basis of the so-called rules-based international order. It needs to rely on specific treaties ratified and put into effect by the international community. Meanwhile, it should be noted that the position of the Global East does not show consistency. It is rather selective. It also places priority to such concepts as sovereign equality of states, non-intervention into domestic affairs, and so on. It asserts that human rights is a matter for national sovereignty, which is contested by international human rights conventions. In my opinion, such an approach contravenes international human rights law. In general, it seems that exceptionalism, double standards, and hypocrisy are the tools for all parties to circumvent obligations under international law. Let me share a final remark under this topic. I'm convinced that both sides have failed to uphold their version. It has been untenable for the Russian Federation to assert commitment to international law since its occupation and annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the war it launched on Ukraine in February 2022. Likewise, the United States and its allies, the Global West, will no longer be able to sustain as strongly as before the notion of rules-based international order, following their policy and practice vis-à-vis extending unconditional support to Israel's military operations in the aftermath of the attack by Hamas on 7 October 2023. In a sense, the notion of rules-based international order has been shattered in Gaza. I must honestly refer to a recent article by Mr. Daniel Depix, which appeared in Chicago Tribune, in the Chicago Tribune on March the 5th, 2024. I didn't stole, I just quoted the title of the article, which stated that the US rules-based order has been shattered in Gaza. But this is my opinion as well. And just for the sake of honesty, I made this reference to the gentleman. We will see now what course of action they will choose to pursue to restore confidence, because the confidence seems to have been depreciated lately. It will also be intriguing to follow if the global South will be able to sustain its solidarity. So both all the global West, global East, and the global South need to revisit their positions in order to revise their positions with a view to returning to the path towards solidarity, international solidarity, aimed at coping with the rising challenges. I'm approaching the end, Professor. Don't worry, it will not be, I think, beyond the envisaged limit. I will now move on to my title related to the UN system and its reform. Let me put on record, just for even at the expense of repeating what is already well known, the United Nations comprises member states, 193 member states, in addition to observer states, but we have 193 member states which comprise the United Nations system. And those member states have the authority and power to make decisions. The UN doesn't make decisions. The UN, under the leadership of or under the supervision of the Secretary General, the Secretariat, the United Nations, executes the decisions made by the member states. This is an important point, I believe, because in order to get criticism towards United Nations fairer, the UN Secretariat and organs are bound to execute those decisions made by the member states. The success of execution of those decisions depend on the extent to which necessary financial and human resources are provided by the member states. Member states make a decision, for example, to provide humanitarian assistance to country X, but if they fail to provide the requisite financial and or human resources to make that happen, then the United Nations can execute such a decision to the extent of the resources provided by the member states. In my personal opinion, I share, and I think the recent figures, current figures, also prove correct. They prove correct my earlier experience. For example, for urgent humanitarian assistance calls and decisions, the funding level never exceeded maximum half of what is required to execute such a decision or to realize such humanitarian assistance as decided by the member states. So it is on the member states to come up and upscale their contributions as required by the decisions they made to enable the Secretariat, the United Nations, to realize to execute properly, effectively the decisions they make. The UN needs a reform, that is for sure. I'm not going into details of that. It has been ongoing since the beginning of 1990s, for the last almost 3 decades. For some time between 2011 and 2014, when I was Director General for Multilateral Political Affairs, I was the Turkish representative to the UN reform process. And I remember I attended several meetings with no avail. I mean, without much concrete progress, because the positions of the actors are so wide, and it has so far been almost impossible to narrow substantively those gaps. There is a general agreement that the organization, which was founded in the aftermath of a devastating world war, needs to be reformed with a view to aligning the composition of certain organs and functioning rules of the organs with contemporary realities. This is a general agreement. There's a consensus on this need. Thus, it can function more efficiently. But states have formed groupings to represent quite divergent views and objectives. Lengthy consultations and negotiations have not yet yielded any significant result. Bearing in mind, we have to bear in mind the difficulty to narrow the differences between those groupings, and also we need to have regard to Article 108 of the UN Charter. It does not seem realistic, unfortunately, to anticipate considerable progress in the foreseeable future. I hope I will be proven wrong, but realistically, it would not be realistic to anticipate considerable progress in the near future, in the foreseeable future. Article 108 of the UN Charter, as you all know, I believe, requires that any amendment to the Charter requires approval, a high threshold approval of the members, including each time approval of all 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Charter cannot be amended without approval by each and every of the 5 permanent members. Let me read. It's a short article just for the sake of remembrance, for reminding. Article 108. Amendments to the present charter shall come into force for all members of the United Nations when they have been adopted by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly. First, we need a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, and ratified in accordance with their respective constitutional processes by 2/3 of the members of the United Nations. Decision by 2/3 in the General Assembly, in order to put it into effect, for it to enter into force, we need 2/3 ratification of the 2/3 of the member states, including, this is important, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. If one member does not ratify or approve any amendment, any proposed amendment, that does have no chance in entering into force. Nonetheless, the international security architecture, at the center of which the United Nations is placed, that was designed in the aftermath of the Second World War, has survived numerous transitions throughout the evolution of the international order we briefly touched upon. It achieved enormous objectives in the last 8 decades. There is a tendency with which I disagree, that if there is a failure or shortcoming, or for due to any reason, that those failures are always highlighted. But those achievements of the United Nations, particularly in the field of international humanitarian law, humanitarian assistance, development assistance, and human rights law, are not highlighted as much as the shortcomings are highlighted. It achieved the shortcomings, in my opinion, as I touched upon earlier, are essentially due to lack of political will for solidarity by the member states. It is true that the UN needs reform, which basically correlates to revisiting the structure and functioning of the Security Council, a principle of organ of the United Nations that holds primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security, decisions of which are legally binding on all member states. It is also true that it will continue to be a challenging task. Perhaps if priorities are set reasonably, I will make an attempt, an amateur attempt to guide for possible progress for the reform. We may have reason to have a certain degree of optimism for progress. The first priority must be to seek the enlargement of the Security Council. Of course, we are talking about the reform of the Security Council as a matter of priority in regard to UN reform, the wider UN reform. The first priority is to revisit the composition and functioning of the Security Council. And for me, I think the priority should be given to enlargement of the Security Council's non-permanent membership, not the permanent membership. The current permanent members, in my experience, should not be expected to relinquish their positions. It would be a non-starter. So for the time being, in order to be able to make progress, to make steps towards progress, it should be the wider international community needs to aim at extending, enlarging the non-membership. And it will be a very challenging process, we know, because there are so many contenders, and perhaps a core group might come up with creative proposals to narrow down the possible enlargement to regions which are not represented fairly in the Security Council. The second priority, perhaps, is to seek convincing the permanent members for a revision of the use of veto power. I would not expect any permanent member to agree, to be voluntary, to volunteer for relinquishing their veto power. But perhaps there were such attempts, I know, in the last 3 decades of UN reform process. And there are still, for example, very recently, I read in the media that Malaysia put forward another proposal to some sort of diluting, or not diluting perhaps, but to revising the veto power. Perhaps if, for example, a Security Council has a large majority, 2/3 or 3/4 majority, then it should, such large majority might be considered to overrule or supersede a veto, one veto power. I mean, such formulations may be worked on. They were on the table, they will continue to be on the table, but realistically, reasonably, only non-membership composition might be revised to a certain extent, not largely. It would render even more inefficient the Security Council, and also the veto power needs to be revised, but depending on the possible approach by or response, positive response by the members, permanent members of the Security Council. Regardless of the I think it's an immense task to realize. We will need to maintain the efforts in that regard without expecting short results in the short period. Regardless of the course of the reform process, in my opinion, the UN system must be preserved unless a better, more effective system has been invented. Personally, I'm not convinced that it is feasible to be able to develop any better system. If there are such proposals, of course, I'm ready to listen. The UN is the stage, if I may make such a formulation. The UN is the stage, like the theater stage, for multilateral dialogue. We have the stage. If decor or the construction needs to be renewed and strengthened, that we can do, we should do. And we also have the scenario, the universal normative framework, the international law, in my opinion, is the scenario. And it is under constant review. It is developed pursuant to the newly emerging challenges. Improvements may be introduced to the stage and the scenario. The problem is with the actors, the member states, acting on that stage. We need to have steps towards enhancing solidarity, common action towards solidarity, with a view to upholding the UN system, with a view to upholding the global normative framework, legally binding global normative framework. Now, last part of my presentation, if I may, Professor, I will refer to the recent reports by the UN Secretary General with regard to the prospects of the United Nations system. The Secretary General was invited to provide inputs to the upcoming global summit this year in September. In September this year, the what do we call it? The Summit for the Future 2024. I will come to that. He produced in 2021, 2.5 years ago, he produced the report titled Our Common Agenda. The report titled Our Common Agenda. And he underlined that humanity faces, and I'm quoting the Secretary General's report, I quote, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice, breakdown or a breakthrough, and that the disastrous effects of a changing climate, famine, floods, fires, and extreme heat threaten our very existence. With the understanding that humanity's welfare and indeed humanity's very future depend on solidarity and working together as a global family to achieve common goals. The Secretary General puts forward an agenda of action designed to accelerate the implementation of existing agreements, including the Sustainable Development Goals. And in last July 2023, he provided a policy brief to the member states titled Our Common Agenda, a New Agenda for Peace. He reminded the member states of the pledge to undertake to promote peace and prevent conflicts as enshrined in the Charter. He underscored in this brief the following, and I quote, "The United Nations is, at its core, a norms-based organization. It owes its birth to an international treaty, the Charter, signed and ratified by the states. It faces a potentially existential dilemma when the different interpretations by member states of these universal normative frameworks become so entrenched as to prevent adequate implementation. Rebuilding consensus on the meaning of rebuilding consensus on the meaning of and adherence to these frameworks is an essential task for the international system." This is what I was trying to imply, as a matter of fact, inspired by the Secretary General's report. And now the Summit for the Future, for the Future 2024, it was decided that a summit will be convened during the high-level segment of the UN General Assembly this year in September. The reports by the Secretary General will provide inputs to the preparations for the summit in the form of an action-oriented recommendations. Before I conclude, Professor, allow me to recall the UN General Assembly resolution on the rule of law at the national and international levels, which I think it is important to recall this important annual General Assembly resolution. What happened to my video? Yes. On the member states in this resolution, annual resolution of the General Assembly, the member states reaffirm the need for universal adherence to and implementation of the rule of law at both the national and international levels. They also renew annually their commitment to an international order based on the rule of law and international law, which together with the principles of justice, it is essential for peace, is essential for peaceful coexistence and cooperation among states. To conclude, I have the following to share with you, Professor. Words are fine. We have nice words. Now it is time for deeds in compliance with such words, with such commitments. For the sake of international stability, peace, security, and prosperity, the international community needs to show solidarity and promote multilateral action to cope with the rising challenges in order to ensure a better future. This requires upholding the UN system. These were my last words, but I will let a former UN Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, a Swedish national, who was Secretary General between 1953 and 1961, who unfortunately died in a plane crash during a mission. And I quote him. I like this saying, so I will finish with this quote. Dag Hammarskjöld stated that, and I quote, "The United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell." I think I leave it there, Professor, and I will be in your hands for any possible questions. I hope it was clear what I wanted to say, but of course I said I'm speaking to a distinguished academic audience, and I continue to be your student. I hope my personal observations, experience in my practice in diplomacy has helped to inspire further academic work. I thank you very much for your kind patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Ambassador. Actually, it was very comprehensive and very informative, very inspiring presentation. And I learned again a lot, and I remembered so many important details. We are always referring them also in our lesson classes, especially international organizations class. We refer again and again these things, but for the public opinion, maybe these things are not enough clear. As you mentioned, and at the end of your presentation, everybody is expecting a kind of the heaven, but not, let's say, being free from any kind of hell. And it is a very important thing to be free from any probable hell, of course. And maybe it is also important to have some important reminders. Now we have a few examples around our country, what kind of thing is war, what kind of implications it may create for humanity. But again, we can see that there is still so big, high expectations from the United Nations. It's like a kind of imagination more than international organization. It seems like a kind of international governance mechanism, but we are not at that stage. It's obvious, especially for these interstate conflicts and confrontations. I'm sure there are some questions and some comments about your presentation and your explanations. Do we have any question or comment?
I have one actually.
I hope rather it's an additional comment, Mansur Hocam, rather than question to squeeze me into the corner.
No, not
Hopefully
at all.
not.
Not at all. Not at all. No, I mean, I also agree with you, Doğan, that the prospect for the revision of the Security Council is not really bright. I have one question with respect to my idea, whether permanent members would be able to consider. I mean, not in the, of course, near future, maybe after the settlement of their problem in Ukraine and also elsewhere, if we can have a real, functioning international system, despite the existing cleavages between China and the US, maybe in the future they may be willing to consider this to distinguish between between the responsibilities vis-a-vis the pacific settlement of disputes and the enforcement actions. They can keep the veto power vis-a-vis the enforcement action. Maybe they can just relinquish their power with respect to pacific settlement of disputes. I'm not sure whether this will be, beneficial for Turkey, for the rest of the international community, whether it will contribute to stability. But do you see any prospect, out of your experience with the international community, do you see any prospect of acceptance by the major powers of such a, I would say, drastic change in their, status? And this is the one. Let me follow with the second one. And, Turkey is so obviously supporting the Italian-led coalition of, how do you call it?
Coffee Club,
Coffee
Uniting
Club,
for
yes,
Peace.
Coffee Club position with the enlargement of the non-permanent members of the UN Security Council. But it's not very much elaborated. Do you have any inside information with respect to Turkey's position vis-a-vis the enlargement option of the Security Council?
It's my turn.
Yep.
Yes, please. We are listening to you.
Yes. For the first part, the general whether we could anticipate any prospect in the foreseeable future, in the near future. For the foreseeable near or foreseeable future, honestly, my answer would not be in the affirmative. I served 40 years in diplomacy. The second half, the last 20 years, I always dealt with multilateral politics, international organizations. What is going on with my, sorry.
No worries. We are listening to you. There's no problem from your, let's say, the microphone.
It may happen, yes. I will try anyhow. I want to see myself. There is I've been involved in multilateral politics, international organizations, also particularly with the UN reform. And since I retired 5 years ago, for the last 4 years, and it is an ongoing, because my tenure was renewed following my re-election last year. I'm an expert of the United Nations, a treaty body system. I'm involved in the international human rights treaty body system, and I have the opportunity to follow the developments more closely from inside, if I may say so. Not, of course, like those diplomats. I'm not part of the official meetings of the Security Council or the General Assembly, but of course, I happen to be on the margins, at least, of the UN system, and I'm following. I have the opportunity to follow more closely. For the foreseeable or near future, I see no prospect for any progressive step by the P5. they are so stubborn. It is a big privilege. It's a privileged position. It's a big power for the P5, which they are never shy to use, which they use without any hesitation. As we have been witnessing in the last couple of months, both sides, for Ukraine, the Russian veto, or for the Israel, the US veto, many of them previously, of course. But still, my impression and my hope, first of all, having no optimism for the near future should not discourage the international community to keep up the work in towards targeting such progress in the Security Council reform issue. I think the pressure needs to be kept up, although there is no realistic prospect in the near future. Later, in due course, depending on certain developments in international balance of power, perhaps it is there is the wishful thinking segment of it, in my opinion, but I believe in a medium term or a longer term, depending on the developments in the international balance of power, the P5 may open up for revision of their veto power to a slight extent by categorizing, as I think Mansur, you said, not on all issues, but categorizing topics, and for certain topics of interest for the whole international community, they may kind of dilute their veto power in a term beyond the short term, not in the near term. I see no such prospect in the near term, let me put it more specifically, until the end of this decade, until before 2030s, I see no such prospect. But depending on the developments in the international balance of power, the P5 may start considering giving up or diluting their veto power on certain topics of common concern for the international community, but not related to their which they think would not undermine their sphere of influence in international politics. As regards Turkey, Turkey was, during my time when I used to be involved in the reform process, UN reform process, Turkey was part of this so-called coffee club, or Uniting for Consensus group. It was a large group, including Mexico and many others. I don't recall specifically, but it was a large group. But later, the members of this informal grouping chose to move to other alliances. So it is no longer an efficient grouping in regard to the UN reform process. Turkey seems to be, of course, for the last 5 years, I have no official information, no formal information, how Turkey is doing in regard to these negotiations. But as far as my impression, based on past experience and certain implications on the current developments, I think Turkey tries to be in the team or among the contenders for a permanent membership of the Security Council. I think Turkey will might have such a chance depending on the domestic developments, because Turkey's credibility has depreciated recently, and under the current circumstances, it is not likely that Turkey may have a prospect as a possible member of the enlarged membership, non-permanent membership of the Security Council. I see no prospect for Turkey in the near future, unless Turkey returns to stable policies, giving confidence to its allies. At the moment, there is no such prospect. Turkey needs to re-establish political stability and return to the rule of law, and then Turkey might be considered to be among the lead contenders for a possible enlarged membership of the Security Council. Turkey will remain in the game, not as an active one at the moment, as far as I can see, and it has no chance in the near future under the current circumstances. If it is an answer to your question, Mansur.
Yeah, thank you.
So, do we have any other question? If not, I will ask my question.
Yes. Meanwhile, I mean, if I may say, Professor Zuhal Hocam, I never checked because while I'm concentrating on my presentation, I was concentrating on my presentation. I never checked the time, and when I finished, I saw that it took up to close to an hour, not an hour, but I think around 50 minutes, longer than I thought it would take. So I'm sorry for the length of my presentation. So it was already
very comprehensive and very informative.
Yeah. Thank you for your understanding.
Your very interesting presentation. So when I was listening to you, that all these things remind me something very important. The last week there was Antalya Diplomacy Forum, and it was very impressively underlining the role of Global South. There was insistence on this Global South, Global South. It is very obvious that Turkey wants to discuss and wants to bring this issue into the, let's say, the table of discussion somehow. And as we know, Turkey tries to discuss on, the reform in United Nations in different forms. And so when you have these categories, these three categories, that reminds me something what you said as an answer to the question of Mansur Akgün Hoca. Global West, Global East, and Global South. So what you say as a part of your answer, this rule of law and not recognition, having again the sympathy of the partners, allies from the Western countries, shall be a kind of prerequisite for any kind of recognition of Turkey as a part of this enlarged membership to the Security Council. So what I see that maybe it's a kind of comment or a question, I'm not sure, that Turkey seems like much closer to Global South, or somehow puts itself closer to this Global South in this the profile and this the insistence on the importance of Global South. So shall we consider it as a kind of change in this role? I don't know, the positioning itself inside the West, a Global West, because we were insisting on being a member of European Union, but now with some other changes, okay, we are not in Global East, okay, but we are not in Global West. So do you think that our new position is Global South?
Zuhal Hocam, thank you for the question. I'm of the opinion that Turkey has been and will continue, should continue to be part of the global West, if there is such a grouping. But as we said, it is not a coalition, it is not a formal negotiating group, it's not a poll, it's not an organization, it's not a formal institution, it is a grouping. Turkey has chosen to be part of the West since the foundation of the Republic. And for me, I am quite solid in maintaining my position. Turkey's international stature, the position, is determined by three main bridges, or whatever you call means. I call them the bridges: the United Nations, the NATO, and the Council of Europe. These are the main bridges. I would hope that the European Union would be the fourth bridge, but that bridge seems to be closed to traffic at the moment, and it may remain closed for some more time under the circumstances. I again refer to my last part of my answer to Mensur Hoca. Of course, Turkey, I'm this saying Turkey, sorry, Turkey is there are obligations on the part of Turkey to realize, and there are of course obligations, there are roles that the allies in the West need to do by revising their current positions. So both sides need to revise their positions and make steps towards narrowing the differences and getting closer and restoring the strong alliance between them. Turkey has been and will continue to be, and the three bridges, United Nations, Council of Europe, and NATO, I wish the European Union could be the fourth, but it is not broken, it is not collapsed, it has not collapsed yet, but it is it seems that it will remain closed to traffic for some time. But Turkey should uphold its commitments to these three main bridges that would continue to determine its international visibility and efficiency. Of course, having these three main bridges does in no way prevent having other bridges. Not only that it does not prevent having further bridges, Turkey, like other states of the members of the international community, needs to have additional bridges in addition, further than these three bridges. That's collaborating with the global South, not only for political, but also for other pillars of international politics. Turkey needs to, maintain and even develop those, construct new additional bridges to the main ones, without collapsing the main ones, upholding its commitments as regards maintaining the flow of traffic in the first three main bridges regularly. Whenever the history, in my opinion, the history indicates that whenever Turkey upholds its obligations with regard to the three main bridges connecting it to the international community, determining its position in the international community, Turkey's visibility and effectiveness and influence in other parts of the globe have become more sorry, I lost the sentence, but have become stronger in other parts of the, because the stronger the ties with the West, for Turkey, the stronger the ties with the West, history indicates that stronger the cooperation and its influence in other parts of the globe. So Turkey, it is, I think, unavoidable, and it is correct to look with sympathy to Global South, to collaboration, to enhancing collaboration, cooperation with the Global South, on the condition that the three main bridges are upheld strongly and without any depreciation or without any harm for these bridges. I don't know if it was an answer to your question, but I lost my track.
Yes, it was a very, very good answer, because you try to explain with some, some examples. They are very attractive, actually, these bridges, and using bridges for the other construction of other bridges are very useful and maybe formative. If there is no more question from our audience, we came to the end of our Wednesday talks with dear Ambassador Erdogan Iscan. Thanks for your contribution. It is a very valuable the speech for MURCIR Wednesday talks. I'm sure this speech will create a good, let's say, the bridge with our international partners, because we would like to be a platform for international discussions on the changing international dynamics, international relations, and generally politics, because we know that the politics by itself is a matter of change now as a result of changing communication skills and other economic the variables. Please follow us from our social media accounts. We are always very active about producing more, especially about this changing international order and Turkish foreign policy. But we have also some other activities like MURCIR analysis. We try to follow up the developments with very informative and brief descriptive writings. Follow MURCIR and please catch our other activities very soon. Next week, we will have our guest speaker from the Egypt, and we are to discuss the positive agenda with Egypt. Thank you very much for your attendance and patience, and have a nice day. Thank you.
On my part, thank you. Congratulations. Keep up the good work, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.